Meanwhile, people gathered at the Gulfport Premium Outlets to unite the light, a night of Jewish pride. Members of the Congregation of Beth Israel lit a giant menorah to signify the miraculous 8-day burning of the oil at the temple after the Maccabees' victory over the Greeks. Of course, this tradition happens during the season of Hanukkah, which means dedication. Hanukkah marks the rededication of the sanctuary itself. People of the Jewish faith believe that this brings God's glory, truth, and light into the world.
Unfortunately, struggle and adversity and persecution is part of the world. That is part of the Jewish experience. And the only way we can fight against that is by not being intimidated, not being scared, and being proud and standing up for what we believe in.
For more information about holiday events happening across South Mississippi, you can always go to GulfCoastWeekend.com.